All right, thanks everybody for coming out. I'm really excited to have you here. For those who don't know, the Conceptual Foundations of Conflict Project is a group at USC and with affiliated people around the world whose mission is to encourage and promote new work in and around philosophy that sheds light on the nature, structure, dynamics, sources, and consequences of interpersonal conflict at all scales. I'm really excited today to have Professor Stephen Darwall, the Andrew Downey Orrick Professor of Philosophy, I think you'll have to read it, at Yale University, one of my own personal professional role models throughout my career. He's done all kinds of fantastic work throughout his career, much of which doesn't touch on interpersonal conflict, but much of it does in very interesting and important ways, touching on concepts as important as the kind of respect that we owe to one another. And today I think we're going to hear about the contrast between that and love in particular.
Right.
So thank you so much.
Thank you. So let's see, can you hear it from here? Or it's good, okay, great. Well, thanks, Mark. Mark and I go back a long way. I first met Mark, I don't know the year, but you probably know the year, when he came into my office in Angel Hall at the University of Michigan. He was an undergraduate at Carleton College, and I was trying to convince him to come to the University of Michigan for graduate school. He did not take my advice. Instead, he went to Princeton, did fine at Princeton, and then, has gone on to an illustrious career. So I'm really happy to be here with you, honored to be here with you. And it sounds like a great program. So it's really happy to be part of that. So the title of this is Two Kinds of Intrinsic Human Value. Does everybody have a handout? Yeah, good. Jesse Jackson used to say, not a handout, a hand up. Okay, I just have handouts. Okay. So I'm going to be arguing that there are two fundamentally distinct kinds of intrinsic human value. One is familiar from mainstream moral philosophy, that is, the philosophy of morality in the sense that Bernard Williams contrasted with ethics. In Williams's usage, morality refers to what we call deontic morality, that is, that part that has to do with obligation, rights, wrong, and so on, and ultimately argue with culpability. Ethics, by contrast, concerns itself with any normative question of what to do or feel. In this sense, Nietzsche and ancient Greek philosophy have philosophical ethics, but they don't really have moral philosophies in Williams's distinctively deontic sense. Another way of getting a fix on this is, if you know Elizabeth Anscombe's famous paper, Modern Moral Philosophy, that's about morality. And what she was actually urging is that we stop doing moral philosophy, so conceived, and start doing ethics. She thought in particular we should do virtue ethics. The form of intrinsic human value that conceptually implicates deontic morality is what Kant calls dignity, which he argues is had by any rational being, and it dictates, he says, that any such being must always be treated as an end in themselves and never as a means only. So understood, dignity is an essentially deontic form of value that entails moral obligations, for example, the obligation to treat others as ends in themselves, and oneself as an end in oneself as well. Like any value or normative entity, dignity must be the fitting object of a distinctive attitude. So I'm going to try to say why I think that's so. The attitude of which dignity is a fitting object is the kind of respect that I call recognition respect, which I contrast with appraisal respect, which is a kind of esteem. It's the kind of respect, recognition is the kind of respect you can demand, you're entitled to, you have a right to. Appraisal respect is something you can earn by how you conduct yourself. The object of this kind of respect is a variety of authority or standing that, I've argued, makes any moral agent or person, in Rawls's phrase, a self-originating source of valid claims. So the idea is that persons have the standing to make claims of other persons. And those persons have the very same standing to make claims of them. So they're accountable to one another. We recognize this form of intrinsic human value, I argue, when we place ourselves in second personal relation to others, or indeed ourselves, and hold ourselves mutually accountable, thereby recognizing their valid claims on us. Now, when I say second person, I don't mean another person. I don't mean a second person. I mean, that's a second party. It's just it's a grammatical concept. So the second person pronoun, you, yous in Pittsburgh, or yuns in Pittsburgh, yous guys in the Bronx, y'all in the South. Those are all second personal pronouns. And when you have an attitude that you naturally express with a second person pronoun, you have a second personal attitude in my sense. And I'll be arguing that both respect and what I'll be calling attitudes of the heart are equally second personal in that sense. They all come with what I call an RSVP. Now I'm arguing today, and I have argued most recently in a book called The Heart and Its Attitudes, that there's a second form of intrinsic human value that is decidedly non-deontic, namely being worthy of care or love. And in particular, I'll be talking about the kind of love that's second personal, that is, that involves reciprocation, an invitation, an acceptance of an invitation, relating to others through love. So this involves what I call attitudes of the heart rather than the attitudes of the will that include the recognition respect through which we recognize human dignity. Unlike attitudes of the will, which mediate mutual accountability and consist in forming the will to respect the justified claims of human dignity and deontic morality, attitudes of the heart mediate heartfelt connection. They open the heart to another in the hope, not the expectation, that the other's heart will be opened to us in return. Although, excuse me, there we go. Although there are forms of caring that don't aim for a second personal connection, there's a kind of care, like sort of caring that parents have for their very young children, that's not really aiming to engage them, but it's focused on them for their sake, that is, on their well-being or their welfare. Now, that's not second personal in my sense. That's actually third personal in the sense that you're not either inviting nor are you expecting any particular return. Your job is to care for the object, to be the servant of their well-being. This means that both forms of intrinsic human value are appreciated through second personal community with others. One is a community of mutually accountable persons, what Kant calls the kingdom of ends. And the other, I'm going to be arguing, is what Martin Luther King Jr. called a beloved community. We recognize both in being with others in a sense that Buber contrasted with Heidegger's notion of free beings existing alongside one another. Being with others involves some kind of engagement between the two. And this can be deontic engagement, as when we hold ourselves accountable to one another, or this can be heartfelt engagement, where we're seeking to have a heartfelt connection with the other. Now, I argue in the second person standpoint that any being who is capable of holding themselves accountable with the qualities of will that Strawson brilliantly described in Freedom and Resentment, what I've called second personal competence, shares a basic second personal authority that makes them self-originating sources of valid claims, thereby grounding basic human rights. Although the psychological capacities for self-reflection, perspective-taking, and to deliberate and form one's will from the impartial perspective of one second personally competent agent, among others, is sufficient for dignity in the sense of second personal authority, I don't argue, neither do I believe, that it's necessary for that standing. To be sure, only second personally competent agents are capable of being morally obligated and therefore of being accountable to themselves or other second personally competent agents as equal members of the moral community. But that doesn't mean that only they can have the authority to make claims and demands. If very young children or even non-human animals do have rights that they lack the capacity to claim on their own, that may just mean that we second-personally competent agents are obligated to constitute ourselves into the collectivities that would be necessary to claim their rights on their behalf. No such challenges exist, however, when it comes to recognizing the non-deontic form of intrinsic human value, and also the value of other non-human animals or non-secondly personally competent humans. Being worthy of care and love is something we share with many other beings, both human and non-human. I argue that any being who has the distinctive reciprocating capacity that is exercised in heartfelt connection, not in mutual accountability, but in opening one's heart and receiving someone into one's heart, is worthy of care, love, and other attitudes of the heart related to them. I conjecture that you, like I, have had heartfelt connection with other animals, and certainly with human beings like very young children who lack second personal deontic competence. If you doubt this, just take a look at videos of elephant grief or think about what it's like to see a baby return your loving gaze. Now, it'll help to understand the kind of intrinsic value that human and non-human beings have in themselves if we contrast it with what G.E. Moore called intrinsic value in both a paper called The Concept of Intrinsic Value, but also in Principia Ethica. The latter, Moore says, is what good, the word good, expresses when it's used in an ethical sense. It's the concept, he adds, of what ought to exist for its own sake. For Moore, good or intrinsic value in this sense is the fundamental ethical concept. All other ethical concepts, including deontic concepts, he thinks, can be analyzed in terms of what he calls the simple, unanalyzable idea of good. Moore is thus not only a consequentialist, but he's an analytical consequentialist, since he holds that, and now this is a quote, "I'm morally bound to perform this action," is identical with the assertion, this action will produce the greatest possible amount of good in the universe. So he thinks those just mean the very same thing. I mean, it's clearly false, and if he'd applied the same kind of open question argument to that definition that he applied to other definitions of good, as Ross famously pointed out, he could have seen this. He did see it later, and he changed his ideas. So he was still a consequentialist, but he wasn't analytical. He wasn't a definitional consequentialist. Now, even when they deny analytic consequentialism, contemporary act consequentialists, however, including act utilitarians, take lead from Moore when they hold that the deontic moral thesis, they hold the deontic moral thesis that what makes moral acts, or what makes acts morally right, is that they produce no less than the greatest total net good of any act available to the agent in the circumstances. Utilitarians and other welfarists, as Sen calls consequentialists who hold that intrinsically good states of affairs include only those in which beings have the greatest welfare, can state their view in Morean terms. What makes someone a consequentialist is that they think that the states of affairs can be ranked in terms of their intrinsic value, and that the best states of affairs are those with the greatest total net welfare. This employs two different concepts of good. This is an important point to see that I think it's not always appreciated. First is the idea of the value of the state of affairs, and then there's the idea of a person's good or a being's good. Those are very different things. As you can say when you say, it would be a good thing if you got your good. So that you have to be employing two different notions there. Utilitarians and welfarists think it's a good thing in itself, an intrinsically valuable state of affairs, when living beings enjoy welfare or have their good realized. But why? Now, I believe, following Elizabeth Anderson, that it's because these beings themselves have intrinsic value. So that's a very different idea, and Moore would not have understood what that idea could possibly have meant. So let's try to understand it. Or to put it another way, it's because they are fitting objects of care or love. Now, I didn't always think this. About 25 years ago, when we were both at the University of Michigan, I encountered this view in a draft of Elizabeth Anderson's Value in Ethics and Economics. Before that, it had always seemed to me that caring for someone was the very same thing as desiring their welfare for its own sake, or if you like, intrinsically. Anderson convinced me, though, that that can't be the case. So when we care for someone, we care about their welfare for their sake and not just for its own sake. So how can you see this? Well, Mill observes in utilitarianism that it's possible through an association of ideas to come to desire something like money, which lacks any intrinsic value for its own sake. We begin by desiring money only for the sake of pleasurable experiences that we can acquire with it. Mill thinks we can come, nonetheless, to want money for its own sake through its association with pleasure over time. But an intrinsic desire for the good of another person can arise in the very same way. So imagine you have an abusive parent, let's say, and you're only happy when they're happy because they'll make you unhappy if they're unhappy, right? And you start off wanting them to be happy, not for its own sake, but for your sake, right? Okay, by the way, I notice I've already introduced this idea of the person themselves as valuable, right? Okay, so you start off wanting them to be happy, you do things to try to make them happy, and over time, through stimulus overgeneralization, you start to desire their happiness for its own sake. But it wouldn't follow from that that you cared about them. It wouldn't follow from that you'd say would feel grief when they died, or you'd feel sadness when they left you. On the contrary, you might feel relief. Okay, so that clarifies the difference between wanting something for its sake and wanting something for someone's sake. And the idea is that wanting that is wanting it out of caring for that person. Okay. To put this in a larger context, we can consider the normativity of these two kinds of intrinsic human value, but I just need to forestall a possible misunderstanding. I've just been talking about caring. Caring, as I understand it, is not necessarily an attitude of the heart. So attitudes of the heart always involve an invitation to reciprocate. They come with RSVPs, and I think that'll be clear as we move along. Caring doesn't necessarily. Okay. To put this in a larger context, we can consider the normativity of these two kinds of intrinsic human value, roughly having dignity, being entitled to respect on the one hand, and being worthy of care and concern. Historically, metaethics has been concerned with what philosophers today call normativity. Not that long ago, it would have been more usual to say ethical rather than normative. But philosophers have increasingly realized that the arguments that led writers like Moore and Sidgwick to hold that there is something distinctive about ethical concepts can be extended to normative concepts more generally, like justified belief, for example, or aesthetic value, just for two examples. Sidgwick held that what is distinctive about ethical concepts is they can all include, now I'm quoting, the fundamental notion represented by the word ought. We can put his point in terms of Moore's famous open question argument. For any non-ethical concept, it's always a conceptually open question whether something that instantiates that concept is a thing we ought to regard or promote in some way or other. Consider Moore's example of what we desire to desire. We may know that something instantiates that concept, but still ask whether we ought to desire it, or whether we ought to desire it. And similar points can be made about any non-ethical concept. The lesson seems to be that ethical concepts can't be reduced analytically to non-ethical concepts. Whether ethical properties can be reduced metaphysically to non-ethical ones is, of course, another question. This line of thought can be extended from ethical concepts to all normative concepts. The reason why normative concepts can't be fully analyzed through non-normative ones is that all genuinely normative concepts, quote, include the fundamental notion represented by the word ought, and non-normative concepts don't. Thus, to a first approximation, we can understand the credible as what we ought to believe, the desirable as what we ought to desire, the estimable as what we ought to esteem, dignity as what we ought to respect in the recognition sense, and so on. This extension of Sidgwick's point is as likely to be put these days in terms of normative reasons or fittingness as it is in terms of ought. Now, I think we can equivalently ask the open question by asking, given that something instantiates some normative concept, is there any normative reason to have some attitude toward it, or would it be fitting to do so in the philosopher's sense of fitting? Now, reasons firsters, like Parfit and Scanlon and Mark, probably myself, and ought firsters, like Sidgwick and Broom, hold that the ideas of normative reason or ought is the fundamental normative notion, and fittingness firsters hold that fittingness, the fittingness of attitudes towards their objects, is fundamental. In saying that something is a fitting object of an attitude, philosophers have a special normative feature in mind that's different from any kind of appropriateness. It's roughly what Adam Smith called propriety. An attitude is fitting, or Smith proper, when it fits its object and not because it is recommended on other grounds, for example, because it would be a good attitude to have or other reasons. We express fittingness relations by saying the object is attitude worthy or able with an A or able with an I. For example, that it is blameworthy or desirable or credible. This will be true only if the attitude is supported by what are called reasons of the right kind. If I offer you a prize to believe a manifest falsehood, there may be some sense in which I give you a reason for having that belief, but I clearly have not given you a reason that renders the proposition credible. Arguably, I haven't given you a reason to believe it at all, rather than a reason to desire to believe or wish you could. We need not concern ourselves with which normative concept is most fundamental. One might take the view that they are equally fundamental and that their equivalence is conceptually guaranteed. Given any one of these notions, we can derive the others analytically. If, for example, a character trait is estimable so that esteem is the fitting response to it, then there will be normative reasons of the right kind for esteeming it, and the trait will be something we ought to esteem. So we needn't really decide between reasons firsters or ought firsters or fit firsters. Perhaps all are equally fundamental and interdefinable. Rather, we should focus on what's common ground between these views. This is that normativity always concerns a relation between an agent, it's a four-place relation, between an agent, an object, a presenting situation, and an attitude. So all normative notions, I think, can be analyzed in terms of that four-place relation. It turns out to be a very tricky thing. How do you analyze the idea of a person's good or welfare? And I have a pretty complicated view about how that works in a book called Welfare and Rational Care. Roughly, something is good for Mark, let's say, if it's something that it would make sense, or in Gibbert's sense, or that there's normative reason for me to want insofar as I care for Mark, or put more perspicuously, if I ought to care for Mark, then I ought to want this thing for Mark, for its own sake. That is, I should want it for Mark's sake. Okay. So we can just have this idea of an ROF attitude. That's one that's supported either by reasons of the right kind, normative reasons, or that's fitting, or that we ought to have. On all three of these approaches, there's a fundamental normative notion, ROF, which is an ineliminable part of any normative concept. Less fundamental, more specific normative concepts all conjoin the fundamental normative notion with different attitudes in different ways. The desirable conjoins ROF with desire, the credible conjoins ROF with belief, the estimable conjoins ROF with esteem, and so on. And some are more complex, like the case of welfare or well-being. Now, in a seeming alternative to the ROF account of normativity is what is sometimes called a value-based account. I think there's a significant problem, though, with any value-based approach to normativity. as Elizabeth Anderson has argued, that values are of irreducibly different kinds. I don't mean that there are irreducibly different kinds of things that have value. I mean there are irreducibly different kinds of value because there are different attitudes that are in play. Anderson holds what seems to me the obviously correct view that value is ambiguous as between different normative notions. For example, desirability, what there is reason to desire, estimability, what there is reason to esteem, and the dignity of persons, just to name just a few. What makes these distinct normative notions is their conceptual connection to distinct attitudes, to desire, to esteem, and to recognition, respectively. To account for the distinctive normativity of these different forms of value, it seems, we must appeal to the attitudes of these distinctive kinds that are warranted or fitting, that is, to ROF attitudes. I take this to be a decisive reason to reject any kind of value-based account. Another way of putting it is there isn't a single value-based account. There must be many different ones, but then because there are many, they can't be the fundamental thing. In what, according to the ROF framework then, does normativity of the two kinds of intrinsic human value consist? This reduces to the question of what the distinctive attitudes are that are conceptually involved in these different kinds of intrinsic value. What are the valuing attitudes that are conceptually implicated in the different forms of intrinsic value that I've distinguished? Now, above I said that the attitude through which we recognize human dignity is recognition, respect, and the one through which we appreciate intrinsic non-deontic human value is love or care. According to the ROF normative framework, then, human dignity is conceptually linked to reason, ought, or fittingness supported recognition, respect. Human dignity is what is in the ROF relation to respect of the recognition kind. Similarly, intrinsic non-deontic human value instantiates the ROF relation as the object that is matched to love or care. Now, again, I've distinguished between a kind of third personal loving or caring that, say, parents can have for their young children, and the kind of love, as Strawson puts it, that seeks reciprocation. That's the heartfelt kind, seeking connection, heart-to-heart connection. I turn now to an initial characterization of the contrasting structure of non-deontic reactive attitudes of the heart. To illustrate the difference, consider the related but contrasting attitudes of guilt and remorse. Now, I wasn't convinced when I first started thinking about this that we actually use the words guilt and remorse to pick out different things. But I ask you to perform the following Google experiment. Google heartfelt guilt and Google heartfelt remorse and see how many hits you get. And of course, it varies day by day, but it's always many, many more hits for heartfelt remorse and not so many at all for heartfelt guilt. Now, why is that? Well, guilt, I think, is an attitude of the will. It's the acknowledgement of a culpable wrong, typically the wronging of another will, along with the setting of the will not to do it again in the future. Remorse, by contrast, is a response less to a wrongful injury in the legal, moral sense, which simply follows from an unjust violation of someone's rights, than it is to the harm to the other person that one has caused. When philosophers write about agent regret, I think they're writing about remorse, or as I use the word remorse, and as they use the word agent regret, I think they're picking out the very same phenomenon. It is the heartsick feeling that one has caused them pain or suffering. Most importantly, it is a response to a wound to their heart, to having hurt them, that is, hurt their feelings, having hurt them in their heart. Which can only be adequately expressed by opening one's heart remorsefully to theirs in the hope that theirs might be thereby healed. It's an attitude of the heart that is heart to heart, whereas guilt is an attitude of the will that is will to will. I'm not going to talk about this in the talk, but we might talk about it in the QA. There's just a wonderful illustration of this involving a guy at the University of Michigan hospitals named Richard Boothman, who was charged with cutting the costs of malpractice to the hospital. And initially, he did what lawyers do. They threaten, defend. Surely we can make a deal. We've got many more lawyers than you possibly have. We can make out a deal that's mutually advantageous. What he ended up convincing them to do was to have the staff, the hospital staff, come into contact in the presence of their people who've been hurt by them, injured by them, if they're still alive, their family if they aren't, and just confess what happened, and then show in a heartfelt way how torn up about it they are, that this happened on their watch. And one of the things that was really bad about the old strategy is it did nothing for the hospital staff. Maybe you win the suit, big deal, but then the doctors and the nurses still felt awful about what had happened. What you get in the new model is an encounter where there's remorse that's being vividly shown to either the injured or their family, and typically tears are shed, and tears beget tears. And so I can describe it, maybe later I'll describe an example where the doctors and the family of the guy who died end up in each other's arms, and then celebrating the guy's life. Okay. So non-deontic reactive attitudes of the heart have the same second personal reciprocating structure that deontic reactive attitudes do. Resentment for a moral injury implicitly addresses a putatively legitimate demand to the person who injured one to, anachronistically, not have done what they did. But it is also a demand that the other acknowledge the legitimacy of one's demand not to have done it, and that they take responsibility for having so acted. Guilt is the reciprocating reactive attitude that implicitly acknowledges culpable wrong. That is, guilt responds to blame. It's an internalization, kind of self-blame. And it's expressed naturally in apology, which leads one to intend to take adequate responsibility for the wrongful injury. Deontic reactive attitudes all implicitly hold their objects accountable and make an implicit demand on them to hold themselves accountable. They respectfully demand respect, will to will. Non-deontic reactive attitudes of the heart, as I should say, so Strawson himself never defines reactive attitudes, he just gives examples. But some of the examples are like gratitude and love that seeks reciprocation, and hurt feelings is another one. They're the things that I'm theorizing in the heart and its attitudes. They also bid for reciprocation. They can't, however, demand it. Take love, for example. When we open our hearts in love to another person, or indeed to any being capable of reciprocal love, we invite them to open their hearts to us in return. This is nothing we can expect, but something we can only hope for. Hope is also an attitude of the heart, as I think of it. Not hoping that something is going to happen, but hope that you place in someone. So there's nothing we can expect, nothing we can only hope. The point is not just that we lack normative standing to demand love, it's that love is not the sort of thing that can respond to a justified demand in the way that respect can, and so cannot be demanded. Unlike respect for legitimate claims, which we must assume to be within the voluntary control of the person of whom we make the claims, love cannot respond to a legitimate demand. It's not within our voluntary control. So if per impossibile, there could be an obligation to love, then it would have to be possible to love someone out of respect for the obligation to love them. But that's psychologically impossible. To get a better feeling for the distinction between attitudes of the will and attitudes of the heart, consider a thought experiment that Lawrence Blum describes of two beings, one who has the second personal deontic competence to hold themselves accountable through their conscience and will, but who lacks any capacity for heartfelt connection, and the other who has both a conscience and a heart. Since it's difficult to imagine a human being who lacks all capacity for emotional susceptibilities, we collect under the term heart, let us suppose that one of them is a Vulcan, as in Star Trek. One is conscientious, the other is both conscientious and loving. Now, this is from Larry Blum's Friendship, Altruism, and Morality, which I think is a late 70s book. And so the example is a little dated. It involves mission control and Joan the astronaut. Okay. Blum asks us to imagine that both are responsible for seeing to it that Joan, the astronaut, in space, to whom they're giving ground support mission control, is kept safe. At one point, this is like the David Bowie song, Mr. Tom, right? Do you know that? David Bowie, you know? Anyway, sorry, I'm into David Bowie. I started singing, but I won't do that. Okay, so at one point, the astronaut spacecraft loses power. We can stipulate that the two workers in mission control do everything possible to try to restore power and save the astronaut's life. At one point, it becomes obvious, however, that nothing further can be done. Power will not be restored, and the astronaut will die. At this juncture, the mental lives of the two diverge. Now, Larry Blum calls these people Dave and Manny. Manny has a conscience but no heart. Immanuel Kant, Manny Kant. And Dave is David Hume, the philosopher of love, right? What a person Annette Beyer called the woman's moral theorist. Yeah. Okay, so you got Manny and you got Dave. So Manny lacks any capacity to feel emotional distress and then grief after the astronaut's death. In addition, doing so would take time that Manny could better employ in attending to other moral duties. I mean, there are always things we should be doing, right? And there's nothing I can do here, then I can't give that another thought. I'll go on to the next duty. But not Dave. So Dave is heartsick. First, he's consumed with distress and then grief. While the conscientious worker, while Manny is susceptible to second personal attitudes of the will, the second is also emotionally vulnerable to those they care about through second personal attitudes of the heart. The former can intelligibly feel guilt for any lapses in their support, but not remorse, which Dave plainly can feel. Okay. So just as respect is the core attitude of the will, present in every instance, so also is love the core attitude of the heart. So, there are lots of different attitudes of the heart. There's trust, gratitude, remorse, and a number of others, hope. And they all involve a kind of love, just in the way that, blame also involves a kind of respect as well. Okay. Most fundamentally, love just is the opening of the heart to another heart in the hope that it will be open to one's own in return. And this is true of all attitudes of the heart. Even personal anger can be seen as a symptom, if not an expression of love, when it's occasioned by another person seeming not to care about us as we would wish them to, and it seeks to get their loving attention, in Murdoch's phrase, by exhibiting the costs of their not doing so. You say you love me, let's see how you deal with my anger. Okay. But love, for all that, is not identical with other attitudes of the heart. This is obvious with remorse. To love is to be disposed to feel remorse when we are the cause of another's harm. But love is not the same thing as remorse. And the same is true with trust, personal anger, and gratitude, among other attitudes. I argue that what's distinctive of second personal love, the kind that seeks reciprocation, is that it seeks reciprocal emotional connection with its object. It seeks to be with its object. To be with someone in the relevant sense is not necessarily to be spatio-temporally near them, it's to be present to one another. Stephen, where are you? I hear that sometimes. Oh, just thinking about philosophy, dear. Yeah, okay. To be present in this sense is either to be actively relating to one another or for it to be common knowledge between them that both are open to that you're present, mutually present. Okay, so far we are in well-trodden territory that philosophical writing about love and friendship has trod. My plumber might just be trying to help me out in the knowledge that, though not just because I'm willing to help them in return, but love that seeks reciprocation is not simply looking for mutual beneficence, as Kyla Ebels-Duggan has argued. Neither is love looking primarily for appreciation in the sense of mutual esteem, mutual admiration society, Aristotle to the contrary notwithstanding. The currency of mutual presence that love seeks is mutual openness to the exchange of attitudes of the heart. Now, I argue that close friends and lovers want to be in one another's presence, not just for mutual enjoyment, but for heartfelt connection. Part of what they want is to behold one another, to contemplate each other's distinctive presence, the way one's friend walks and talks, which gladdens the heart. We want to be there for one another, not just to share joy and enjoyment, but also challenges, sadness, and grief. To listen to, hear, and feel one another. In all these ways, love involves the heart opening oneself to another heart in the hope that it will be open to one's in return. When love is rejected, it is natural to feel hurt and saddened, to feel heartsick or heartbroken. People who also feel anger and often resentment as well, but neither of these are really heartfelt responses. As we noted earlier, personal anger, as opposed to indignation or moral anger or resentment, is a non-deontic reactive attitude. It's the form that anger takes in personal relationship and so occurs against the background of the angry person's wish for heartfelt connection with the object of their anger. But its emotional function is not itself heartfelt connection with the object of their anger. It's to defend the angry person against wounds to the heart and to attempt to direct the attention of the would-be friend or lover in ways that might lead them indirectly to care more or to direct their care to what the other cares about. Anger doesn't come directly from the heart, since to do so would have to be aimed at the other's open heart, not as a target to pierce, but as a source of reciprocal good feeling. Resentment is even farther afield, since it attempts to call someone to mutual accountability, and love is not the sort of thing for which one can be accountable. The heartfelt responses that are fitting to unreciprocated love are similar to those that respond to unfulfilled trust. So I'm going to shorten this a bit. So there's a chapter on trust and hope in the Heart Book. And the idea is that, many people have argued that trust is from a participant stance. That's how it differs from reliance. But the thought also here is that in trust, you invite the other person to trust in your trust. So it has this reciprocal aspect to it, and it's heartfelt. So what are the three? Hope, faith, and charity. And you could think of faith as trust. Gratitude's another example that I have a chapter on. So what makes something a reactive attitude in general is its reciprocating second personal structure. Then that commits Strawson, since Strawson says that gratitude is a reactive attitude, to thinking that gratitude has this structure just like all of his other examples. But Strawson doesn't say specifically what this consists in all as he says that it responds to someone's goodwill, general goodwill. As I've said at the outset, writers following Strawson have focused on the deontic examples of reactive attitudes, where he also says that they are responses to the other person's will, whether it's good or ill. Here, as we saw, it's most natural to interpret goodwill as respect. That is, as a disposition to respect others' legitimate demands, both their personal ones and the ones they make on behalf of the moral community. But goodwill cannot mean that if gratitude is a natural response to it, for the simple reason that generally anyway, it's not fitting to respond to what can be legitimately demanded, that gratitude isn't generally a fitting response to that. As we say, you didn't have to do that. Gratitude is thus like love, trust, and remorse in being a second personal attitude of the heart. It opens the heart of the one having the attitude to others toward whom they have it and who are thereby implicitly invited to share heartfelt connection through reciprocating attitude. There are then, I'm arguing, two fundamentally different kinds of Strawsonian reactive attitudes. Attitudes of the will that mediate mutual accountability, that is conceptually implicated in deontic morality, in the very idea of moral rights and duties, including both that are owed to others, so the correlates of their rights, but also those that involve accountability to the moral community or to anyone just as a representative of the representative person. Attitudes of the heart, by contrast, though they have the same second personal reciprocating structure as attitudes of the will, they don't mediate mutual accountability. Rather, they mediate mutual responsiveness of the heartfelt connection we seek in personal relationships of love and friendship, however broadly construed. The difference between deontic and non-deontic reactive attitudes, then, is that whereas the former mediate mutual accountability and presuppose that both parties share a fundamental dignity or second personal authority, the latter aims at heartfelt connection and presupposes that both parties have an intrinsic value of a fundamentally different kind. Dignity in the relevant sense is that through which we are entitled to exact respect, as Kant puts it. The intrinsic value that's presupposed in second personal attitudes of the heart, by contrast, is that both parties are worthy of love. At the most general level, the structures of deontic and non-deontic reactive attitudes are identical. Both must assume that their objects are capable of the relevant attitudes, both towards the other and towards themselves. And both must assume that both parties have a kind of value that makes the attitude that recognizes the value fitting to its object. In the case of second personal attitudes of the heart, both participants must see each other as capable of and deserving of love. And in the case of deontic attitudes, both must see one another as capable of and entitled to respect. Human beings thus instantiate two quite different kinds of intrinsic value. They are fitting objects of both love and respect. Thus, there are two different senses in which we can do something for someone's sake. We can do it out of love or we can do it out of respect. These fundamental dimensions of human value are registered in two different ways that we can be said to hold another person. We can hold them and hold ourselves accountable, or we can hold them in our hearts. So, this is the last section. The two kinds of intrinsic value are both fundamentally second personal, recognized by two different kinds of second personal attitudes, of the will and of the heart, respectively. The individuals linked by these two different attitudes form, through these bonding attitudes, two different kinds of ethical community. One is a mutually accountable community of second personally competent, deontically competent persons, a Kantian kingdom of ends, that are bound together by mutual respect that recognizes their shared dignity as self-originating sources of valid claims and is accountable to one another. The kingdom of ends is a Kantian transcendental idea and not any actual community of actual persons. It is what we presuppose when we make deontic moral judgments and hold ourselves accountable to one another through the reactive attitudes of moral blame. Among the things we're obligated to do as individual persons is to bind ourselves together in actual collectivity so that we can discharge obligations that we have to do things together. For example, to protect rights and enforce claims of non-second personally competent beings, whether human or non-human. This community of right, like any actual community of free beings, can only be formed second personally by Fichtean summonses. Fichte has this idea of what he calls an alpha ordering, a summons. His idea is that we come into recognition of a fundamentally different kind of freedom that we have to have and have to presuppose other people as having when we're in this second personal relation of hearing a summons and responding to a summons, which commits us, he thinks, to fundamental principles of right. There is, however, a second presupposed ethical community whenever we have second personal attitudes of the heart, opening our hearts to other individuals, human or non-human, and inviting them to receive us into theirs. We might call this, following King, the beloved community, bearing the same relation to second personal attitudes of the heart that the kingdom of ends does to second personal attitudes of the will. This also presupposes a second personal competence, but in this case, it's not the capacity for mutual accountability. It's rather the capacity for heartfelt connection through reciprocating second personal attitudes of the heart. The beloved community is thus more expansive than the kingdom of ends. It extends as widely as any being with whom we can have heartfelt connection, whether they have deontic second personal competence or not, be they human or non-human. If we follow out the analogy with the kingdom of ends, the beloved community is not an actual moral community of actual individuals. It's rather a transcendental idea that we presuppose when in heartfelt connection, we implicitly affirm that those with whom we are in heartfelt connection are worthy of love, that they have the heartfelt kind of intrinsic value. Also, like the kingdom of ends, we see ourselves called to relate second personally in this case, to open our hearts to others and form actual beloved communities, whether one by one or in personal relationships or in more expansive collectivities. So there we have it. Two kinds of basic human intrinsic value rooted in two kinds of second personal competence provided by conscience and by the heart. The first suits us for membership in the community of mutually accountable equals, and the second suits us for membership in the beloved communities that extend to include both human and non-human beings with whom we can have heartfelt connection. Thanks very much.
First, do you think it's possible that they could one day, or maybe currently, have these two sorts of values? And if your answer is not a straightforward no, then which value do you have more confidence in technology and which you have less?
Well, there's something that today's New York Times about that the most effective AI is likely not to be the sort of large language models, all-purpose, but rather the more focused ones that can do specific kinds of things. That doesn't help with your question. I say what would have to be true in order for an AI to have a heart, and what it would have to be true, and hence, heartfelt value, intrinsic value, and they'd have to be capable of heartfelt connection. Look, I mean, I think the mere fact that they're constructed, that they're virtual, or that they are, come out of computer programs or whatever it is, I don't think that automatically disqualifies them. But they'd have to be able to have feelings. They'd have to be able to enter into heartfelt connection. That's for the heartfelt side. And then the other side is they'd have to be able to hold themselves accountable. Now, when I say guilt, you might think, well, that's inappropriately, connected to human beings. So human beings are capable of guilt. Is it true that any being who has second personal deontic competence has to have the very same kind of emotion. I don't think that's true. They have to have something that has the same structure as guilt. That is to say, they have to be able to make a demand of themselves from a certain point of view. They have to be able to make a distinction between a mere demand and a legitimate demand. They have to make a distinction between what I happen to be feeling now and what I justifiably would feel. But if I don't see any reason in principle why that couldn't be satisfied by non-human beings. I mean, so Spock, for example, not a human being, but maybe Spock doesn't ever feel guilt, but Spock is a very responsible moral agent. So I have no idea what the answer to the question is, and I think if anybody thinks they do, they're wrong. They couldn't possibly. Stay tuned, Maybe you'll find out someday. I'm pretty sure I won't. Yeah, thanks.
All right, I've got a room followed by your reads. I haven't touched.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. Let me come nearer to you. I can't quite hear you. Yeah.
My question is about self-love.
Self-love, yeah.
Yeah, so does it seek this reciprocation?
Yeah.
And if it does,
Yeah.
does it work
Yeah.
in the same way?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, paradoxically, I think it does. So first, let's distinguish between self-love of the kind that's heartfelt and what 18th century philosophers called self-love. What they meant by self-love was just the desire for one's own greatest happiness. So Butler, for example, or Hutcheson, or that's what they're just focused on that. And the idea of prudence, the prudent person who's focused on maximizing their own utility. Okay, that's not self-love in the sense we're interested in. We're interested in heartfelt love. Can I have a heartfelt connection to myself? I think I can. And how can you see that? Well, suppose you're in a therapy session and the therapist asks you to recall a particularly painful memory from your childhood. I'll give you one. So for those of you, if you look at the Heart book, the introduction talks about my mother, who was a paranoid schizophrenic. And relating to a paranoid schizophrenic is not a lot of fun, let me tell you. Okay, so I'd come down in the morning, sorry, this is just playing for tears here. Come down in the morning, she'd be seated on her antique sofa, and I'd come down and I would have, I'd come down with trepidation. How is she going to respond to me? Well, she was almost catatonic at this time, and she had this look of confusion and anger. Like, WTF happened to me, and why did you do it? So kids often internalize that. I certainly did. I felt terrible guilt about this. Okay, now, here I am, and now I'm in the therapist's office, and he asked me, he said, what did that feel like? And I thought, it's awful, And so now I'm in a position of being able to have sympathy for myself, right? And yeah, I can be I can either attend to myself lovingly or not. Most of us don't. And I think it's also true that to be capable of loving others in this heartfelt way, you have to be able to love yourself in this heartfelt way as well. So yeah, all of these things I think can carry over. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Okay, Jim. Okay, Marie, and then we'll take the first question from the Zoom.
Can you hear me? I'm back here.
Oh yeah,
But
gotcha. Yeah.
I had a question about holding accountable.
Yeah.
Holding somebody accountable and
Yeah.
showing love for them.
Yeah.
So in your malpractice case, it struck me that a way of caring for someone is wanting them to be held accountable because it's always going to be good for them to go to the penance or to the process of healing with someone else or something like that. So
Yeah.
it feels like even though holding accountable is something related to recognition, respect, I also kind of identify it with loving someone, that you want them to be held accountable. It feels like a very kind of, like, if you have a child and your child does something wrong, it feels part of loving them.
Yeah, good. Yeah, right, right, right. So I think there are relations between these things. So take the child example. Suppose you're the child's parent. So insofar as you're the child's parent, you want what's best for the child in the long run. And you might think that always getting off without doing the emotional work of taking responsibility is not really good for the child in the longest term. I mean, Baldwin, for example, James Baldwin, says things about white people and white guilt. And there's this marvelous debate between James Baldwin and William F. Buckley in the Cambridge Union in 1965 that I actually talk about in the Heart book a bit. If you haven't seen that, take a look. But so he talks about this sheriff who takes a cattle prod and pushes it against a woman's breast. And he says, Baldwin says, what happens to the woman is ghastly, of course. But what happens to the man is actually something far, far worse. He becomes somebody who could do this kind of thing. His soul is misshapen. And ultimately, that's bad for him. So so Baldwin is a philosopher of love. I do think holding someone accountable is different from loving them, but these things are intimately connected. So I have a paper called Responsibility Within Relations, where I say, in personal relations, mainly we're looking for love. We're not looking for accountability. But when the other person slips into someone who we can't hold accountable, then that's a poison of love. So there's a psychologist named John Gottman who has this saying that contempt is the sulfuric acid of love. So and he would look at films of videotapes of couples just talking to each other, and he knew that if one started to look at the other with contempt, that it was over, that they wouldn't be together, in 2 years. I think these things are intimately related, but they're quite different. And I'm not sure I really responded to what you were asking, though.
I guess I was thinking that somebody who didn't like the idea of recognition and respect could still get a lot of holding accountable, just be a love.
Yeah.
Because it seemed that there's this very similar thing you got of love, which is wanting people to get punished or get repentance or get deliverance. And one could maybe justify it with a thinner notion of love or something like that without necessarily giving to respect.
Yeah, I'm still not sure I'm quite getting this, but one more time, sorry.
Sorry, I feel a little okay. What I was thinking was somebody could reject recognition and respect.
Yeah.
Not like recognition and respect, but like the accountability part of recognition and respect.
Yeah.
Say, no worries, I'm gonna get that, just be a love. Because love is also a way of like holding people accountable. Loving them,
yeah.
Holding them accountable.
Yeah, that I'm actually denying. I don't think that loving is a form of holding them accountable. It's in a different register. I think if you're dealing with someone who you won't hold themselves accountable or won't be in relations of mutual accountability, it's going to be very hard to love them, unless they're just beings like young children who can't be in relations of mutual accountability. But look, so in love, we have our hearts at risk. And you don't want your heart at risk with somebody who's going to do you dirt, right? So, and we're accountable for not doing each other dirt. That's wrong, right? So there's a song, I forget the singer, Take Good Care of My Heart, okay? We can hold people accountable for taking care of our hearts because they can do that without opening their hearts to us, okay? So that's a form of accountability. And it's of interest to us, particularly in this kind of case, because we don't want to be subject to the unaccountable, people who want to just take advantage of us. Yeah. Thanks.
All right, we've got a first question from the Zoom, and then we'll go to your question.
All right, so I have a question from Yiddy from the Zoom chat. The comment in question is, thank you for the great talk. I wonder if there's any difference between heartfelt connection and empathy.
Oh, good, thanks. Well, empathy can mean many different things, first. And one thing to know is that empathy in our current sense wasn't really a term until the early 20th century, I think. So Adam Smith and Hume talk about what they call sympathy, but it's closer to what we think of as empathy. Okay? And Smith is, the great, this is Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments, which I think is the great English language work on moral psychology. Smith has the idea that what he means by sympathy requires perspective taking, putting yourself in somebody else's perspective. Hume, not so much. Hume is about contagion, catching other people's feelings. These are profoundly different phenomena. Here's an important difference. When I catch your feeling through emotional contagion, I don't necessarily have in mind the same object as you have. To do that, I have to put myself in your shoes, right? So you come into my room, you're really angry. I'm really angry too. I'm hot and bothered, you're hot and bothered, so that makes me hot and bothered, okay. Am I angry at what you're angry about? Probably not, I'm probably angry at you. I was having a great day and now you're bringing all this stuff into my space. Get out of here, right? So now, what do empathies of these different kinds have to do with, I'll take it a little bit more broadly, both mutual accountability and heartfelt connection. So I argue in the second person standpoint that empathy of the perspective-taking kind is essential for what I call second personal competence and what I'm here calling second personal deontic competence. That is for being mutually accountable. Why? Because for you and I to figure out whether you wronged me or not, you and I have to be able to put ourselves in one another's perspective, but also not just each other's perspective, to be able to reason from an impartial version of a second person standpoint. Okay, that's not essential for heartfelt connection. For heartfelt connection, I have to sort of feel what you feel. And it's not contagion. It's yet another form of empathy, which involves sharing your feeling. So one form of empathy is definitely necessary, I think, for deontic second personal competence, for mutual accountability. That's the perspective-taking kind. And then there's this other feeling your feeling, which I think is essential for heartfelt connection, for our hearts to be joined. I remember one time when I was in graduate school, I think I took a woman wanted to drive from somewhere to somewhere, and I was driving, so I took her, and she was really, very hippie-like, and I was, a stuck-up graduate student. And so anyway, we were having trouble sort of connecting with one another. And at one point, I said something, she said, "Oh, I feel like our hearts just smiled at each other." So, yeah. I'm not sure that's what heartfelt connection is, but anyway, that's, yeah.
Okay, your question, and Matt, that's your end.
I just wanted to ask, with your many years of experience within this, one, what would be your definition for intrinsic value, or intrinsic human value, and also what would you define as love?
Okay, so two questions. Well, I'm arguing there isn't a single definition for intrinsic human value. I think it has to do with being the object of a justified attitude that can be held to human beings. And I'm arguing there are these two fundamental, different kinds of valuing attitudes. One is respect, and one is love, or a heartfelt love. What's my definition of love? Can mean many different things. I sort of distinguish sort of caring, which is not necessarily inviting reciprocation, with what Strawson calls love of the kind that seeks reciprocation. And that's, I'm arguing, what's at the bottom of all heartfelt connection, and therefore the attitude that responds to the second form of intrinsic human value. Yeah, good.
Got Mathis and then Jordan.
Yeah, thanks very much for the talk. I wanted to ask, I wanted to ask about the distinction between love and respect, but in relation to Kant.
Relation to?
Kant.
Immanuel Kant, Manny. Right, okay, sorry. Oh yeah.
Exactly. So Kant is about money. So
Yeah.
two questions. I mean, one is that I take it that like he would be considered Manny as somebody who seems to be like completely absent. Like there is just nothing of love, nothing of the heart.
Yeah.
It seems to me is a caricature that arises because in the groundwork, Kant pursues a certain grounding project, one would say, and that's why he wants to say, well, it's not consensus, but but actually, I mean, especially in metaphysics of morals, imperfect duties to others, to yourself, there's a lot of stuff that seems to be part of love and the heart.
Yeah. Ooh.
But there are differences. So, for example, it seems that Kant wants to say you can expect gratitude, which is something that you deny. But anyway, so one question would be: so would you agree there are things related to the heart in Kant, but he puts them like in duty terms. He has like you have a duty to sympathy, for example. But also Kant engages in this grounding project.
Also.
So, second question, Kant engages in this grounding project, it seems. And I'm wondering whether you would agree, okay, Kant kind of engages in a certain grounding project where ultimately all of ethics and of course obligation is supposed to be grounded in reason, whereas you're just saying, well, I just want to make a distinction between love and respect, and you do not engage in, as it were, a grounding project that you wonder whether one of the two is more prominent.
So Kant distinguishes two kinds of love, what he calls practical love and what he calls pathological love. Pathological just means it involves feeling, right? So Manny, in the example, doesn't have pathological love, but he does have practical love. And practical love is tied, I think, so we'd have to look at the text to see exactly what you want to lean on, what I want to lean on. But if there's an imperfect duty to love in the practical sense, that is to promote others' ends, right? Okay, then it's an imperfect duty. It's nothing that anybody can demand. It's not a strict duty. Now that's not a heart thing, as I'm understanding it, because you're back in Manny's territory, right? So Manny is capable of practical love. He certainly feels the force of an imperfect duty to promote the ends of others. He just doesn't resonate with their feelings, right? So, and I think, Kant has this view that the term pathological is unfortunate, but it just involves inclination in Kant's distinctive sense. And Kant thinks it's only finite rational agents, like we human beings, that have inclinations. And pure practical reason knows nothing of inclinations. So I have this book that came out a couple of years ago called Modern Moral Philosophy, from Grotius to Kant. And the chapter on Kant gives a reading of Kant that's quite different from anything I would have done before. It turns out that all the deontic concepts, duty, imperatives, obligations, none of these have any meaning for pure practical reason. They only arise from the perspective of what he calls a finite agent, an agent who's subject to inclination. So pure practical reason has no connection with the heart. Heart, in the sense I'm talking about, is going to be on the inclination side, so on the pathological side. And I don't see anything in Kant that sort of resonates with what I'm saying about heartfelt connection. But maybe you know texts that might help with that.
Well, I would have been inclined to read these imperfect duties
Yeah.
as addressing something that you want to get with the heart, but you were denying that.
Yeah.
I mean, the second question, just briefly, was like, would it be accurate to say Kant is engaging in a certain kind of grounding project, as we might call it nowadays, whereas you just want to make this distinction?
Sorry, but you mean the grounding project in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals? Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of orthogonal, I think, to what I'm arguing. So, as he argues in the third section of the groundwork, he's trying to derive the idea of autonomy, where autonomy means his distinctive sense, the property of the will to be a law to itself, independently of any of the objects of inclination. Objects of desire, I guess it is. And he makes this argument in the third section of the groundwork that we have to presuppose that when we are trying to deliberate about what to do. He gives up that idea in the second critique, and through the fact of reason goes the other way around and says, no, we just, once we see ourselves as obligated, and by the way, just parenthetically, I can't omit to note, as finite rational agents, not as pure reasoners, because the fact of reason doesn't arise for pure practical reason. Pure practical reason just necessarily does whatever would be best to do, acts for the sake of das Gute. Anyway, so if you take that, if that's what you mean by the grounding project, I think there's in my terms, I'm interested in a grounding project for deontic morality. That's what the second person standpoint is all about. It's trying to provide a transcendental adduction of the very possibility of certain kinds of reasons. And it's arguing that we're committed when we make putatively legitimate claims and demands of one another to seeing each other as capable of responding to those, and so we're bound in mutual accountability. So I'm quite interested in that project. I don't know that there's something similar on the heartfelt side. One way of putting it is, you show me good reasons to respect you, that you have a claim, then I'll just respect it. I follow the argument with respect. There's no argument you can follow to love. It doesn't admit of that. There's a ground, but it's a ground you can only appreciate through love itself, I think, and in being in relations, being loved. Yeah, that's the thought.
Great. We got Jordan and then John.
I wanted to ask about going back to what characterizes the distinction between attitudes of the heart and attitudes of the will.
Yeah.
So you say that love can't respond to demands because love is not under our voluntary control. So it's not the sort of thing that even could respond to a demand for love. Which that totally tracks for me. But then a worry might be that you might actually think that this holds for attitudes of the will as well, maybe. So the worry is that I'm wondering if respect itself actually seems like it can fail to respond to even legitimate demands in this way. So, if I lose respect for you, it seems like one thing that I've lost is the ability to respond to your demands.
Yeah.
So I was curious what you thought about that.
So when I hear the phrase, I've lost respect for you, I've lost what I call appraisal respect for you. Like, you can't just lose recognition, respect. So when we say I've lost respect for you, I mean the way you lead your life, the way you conduct yourself. You no longer warrant one kind of respect, but it's not recognition respect. So the idea would be that, look, you still have the rights of any human being, but don't expect me to esteem you or the way you live your life. But I do think it's true about recognition respect that, look, somebody can be entitled to recognition respect and I can fail to respect them, obviously. That can happen. But what I can't do is see that they're entitled to respect and fail to respect them. because for me, because respect, what is respect? It's an attitude of the will. How do I form it? By just treating you as a person. I say, man, just treat me as a person, right? I say, oh, sorry, yeah, I will. And so I don't have to wait for the moment where my heart is engaged. No, it's not about the heart. It's about just doing what you can do. Do your job, and I'll do mine. And when I say and I'll do mine, I don't mean that my doing mine is a condition of your doing yours, or your doing yours is a condition of my doing mine. I just mean that we're both presupposing that we can do our job. So morality is just basically about doing your job. Yeah. So, Kant has this brilliant stuff at the end of the second critique about moral education. He says, look, you want to show people these paragons of virtuous people, because then people get the idea that it's some big accomplishment. It is not a big accomplishment. It's just do your job. And also there's this fabulous line in Kant about that he used to think that the glory of human beings was cultural achievements of one kind, another. But Rousseau set me right. And I saw that any person has the same dignity as any other person. Or there's this wonderful line in the second critique, before a common, humble, upright man, my spirit bows, though I walk by him ever so proudly. So, because I see in his example, he's just doing his job. And that's all you have to do. Yeah.
John McPherson.
I wanted to ask about, you've distinguished several times between the form of love that has the second personal aspect and caring, which need not.
Yeah.
And I guess I just wanted to hear more about why being an apt or fitting or whatever object of care wouldn't be its own sort of further kind of intrinsic value.
Yes.
Because the second personal thing seems
three
to
kinds.
narrow the
Next time,
scope.
3 kinds of intrinsic value. But yeah, no, I think exactly right. That right. So being worthy of care means being worthy of this distinctive attitude, caring. And I'm, as you just pointed out, I'm distinguishing these different attitudes. So there's third personal caring and there's second personal loving. And we could flip the words, that doesn't matter. But the attitudes are distinct. And and both can be fitting or unfitting. And so there can be such as, I think we say someone's worthy of care and they're worthy of love. I think these are somewhat different attitudes, but they're both values. And so they're both intrinsic. So wrong title. 3 kinds of intrinsic human value. Yeah, thanks.
Iris, there's another question from the Zoom.
Hi, Professor Darwall, and
Hi.
I really enjoy reading this piece. And I noticed that you believe love is non-deontic.
Yeah.
So it means that we do not really have the obligation to respond to others' love. Is that right?
Yeah.
So my question is, even in some special cases like relationship between parents and children, or a loving relationship, or marriage, is that still we do not have such obligation?
Yeah. Good question. I think Matthew Lau has a book about this, like parents' duty to love their children. Okay. I think there is a duty to care for their children, to take care of them, not to be negligent, to be careful. Okay. Now that's different from having an obligation to open their hearts. Okay. Now, but still, you might think, well, why don't parents have an obligation to open their hearts? Because they can do real damage to their kids if they don't. So I would agree that in that case, it's that part of what there is for them to care for their children is for them to open their hearts to them and be in heartfelt connection with them. It's somewhat different things, but they're still. Now, suppose you've got someone who can't, say a rape victim, where the child was born as a result of a rape. She's traumatized by that. she can't, let's just stipulate, open her heart. Now you might think, well, does she have an obligation to? We say, well, you could choose between two things. She has an obligation to, but we can't blame her, so she has an excuse. Or we could say, no, she doesn't really have an obligation to. And I'm not sure there's a big difference there. But yeah, I do think it's a little glib for me just to say there's never any cases where there's an obligation to open your heart. So this raises the question, what is it to open your heart, right? Because that's something we talk about doing or not doing, right? So if my heart is closed, it doesn't just happen to be closed. I may close it. Why? Because I want to be defended against having my heart hurt, right? So we can certainly say to people, don't be so defensive. And I can say to myself, don't be so defensive, right? And that's something I can do. So these things, it's more subtle than it might seem from what I said. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Another question from the Zoom, and then Shazar, did you have a hand? Yeah, well, Shazar next.
All right, great. So Ishmael from the Zoom says similarly, why doesn't love carry any obligations? You say that we cannot expect love, but only hope for it. But the phrase, quote, failure to love makes sense to me. At least I have the intuition that failure to love humans is blameworthy. Why can't we say that there is an obligation to love, at least unless the other person is a really bad person? Wouldn't an account of love and a beloved community closer to respect with its own similar demands on others be more compelling and inspiring?
Sorry. I'll do my best. Well, as I was saying, I mean, there can be an obligation to try to love. There can be an obligation to not be defensive. And I think so. If I think everyone is worthy of love, and everyone has the capacity to love, then I've got to think that if love fails to take hold, it's got to be because of some closing of some heart. Now, whether that's voluntary or not is a very tricky matter, as these edge cases can suggest. So there is the intrinsic value of being worthy of second personal love. There's the intrinsic value of being worthy of care. And there's the intrinsic value of being entitled to respect. So only the latter is deontic, and so it's clearly within the purview of the will, as I'm understanding it. But there are these aspects where if people don't actually care, or they aren't actually in heartfelt connection, it's because of something that they've done, or are doing right now. Look at me. You won't look at me. You know. We can. That's within the space of the demandable. So yeah, it's a messier story than I'm trying to paint it.
Sorry, and then Nasha.
Hello, my question pertains to how severe is the effect of socialized gender on love and its capabilities. So I believe that when you're born, male or female, you're socialized to care and love in different ways. So how severely does that affect their capabilities of love depending on your gender?
Yeah, right. So clearly, the work of care, let's call it that, is gendered in a patriarchal society, and hence in our society. You know, it often happens that you'll have couples who are pretty egalitarian until a baby comes around. And then the question is, okay, who's going to take care of the child? And it's often a vexing question, and maybe there are age differences, and maybe they're in different careers or whatever it is, but we just know these statistics that after 10 years or so, the men are likely to be less engaged with taking care of their children than women are. So that's an injustice, manifest injustice, and we should resist it. And so we're obligated, I think, to do so. And this is for the good of all concerned. It's for the good, certainly, of the children. It's for the good of the women who are otherwise encouraged or sometimes, manipulated into playing that role. And I think it's in the end good for the men as well, in something like the way that Baldwin would argue that, getting rid of white supremacy would be good for white people as well as for black people. So yeah, it's a lot of this is under the shadow of gender. Yeah.
Thanks. I got Yasha and then Vivek.
Hello. I was initially wondering about whether you thought there was just two or whether there could be more, but then it sounds like.
Well, I've got three now.
So I'll ask a different question.
I don't see another one peeking over the horizon.
I don't know. Maybe there will be seven. But I was interested in the principle that you attribute to Anderson.
Yeah.
So there's like intrinsic value of state of affairs.
Yeah.
And then at least one, all else equal, one state of affairs is better than another. If like a person is like better off in one versus the other, and why is that? Well, it's got to be because like the person is like intrinsically like themselves is somehow like worthy of intrinsic, has intrinsic value.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how that principle works in a framework where there are now all of a sudden two, or maybe three, or maybe even more kinds of intrinsic value. I could see two ways of it going.
Mm-hmm.
One is that just as there's like two kinds of intrinsic value at the level of the human, there's also two kinds of intrinsic value at the level of the states of affairs. And so we can do a ranking for like a heartfelt ranking of states of affairs and also a respectful ranking of states of affairs. And there's nothing else. Or another thought is that it kind of collapses at the level of states of affairs. So like, as long as you have like one of the kinds of intrinsic values, that's all that matters. And all of a sudden, what's good for you is just good for the state of affairs. And so it turns out that like the distinction at the level of human beings collapses at the level of states of affairs. So I was wondering how you think about that.
Well, the first question is, what does it mean for a state of affairs to have intrinsic value in the relevant sense? Now, in the Anderson view, there's got to be some attitude that it is the fitting object of. Okay, what is that? I think Parfit says, well, it would be some sort of impersonal valuing. On What Matters, I think Parfit uses the phrase, good in the impartial reasons involving sense. So the idea is something like, if you took the perspective, and it was impartial, not impersonal, but impartial, between whom? Well, all beings, all persons, all beings worthy of care, you would want a certain state of affairs. Okay. Now, that's where I think the Anderson point's coming in, right? So if we take the perspective of impartial as between human beings, then we'll get one idea. If it's impartial as between all second-personally heartfelt, competent beings, we get a somewhat different one. But I think the basic thought is first to get clear about what intrinsic value of a state of affairs can mean. And Moore is helpless here, gives us no help. It's for the state of affairs ought to exist for its own sake. What could that possibly mean? So I think Moore is just wrong that the fundamental ethical notion is intrinsic value in that sense. The fundamental notion, I think, is ROF. It's normative reasons, ought, or fittingness. And then we just have to get clear about what would be the relevant attitude. And there's some choice points there. And then the Anderson question is whether we'd be interested in those choice points if we didn't first value the beings in some relevant way. And we might get different answers for different versions of that. Yeah. Thanks.
Irene and then Max.
Yeah, hi, I'm here. Yeah, thank you for this. It's super interesting. So I was wondering how we are to make sense of the action guiding role of ethics when we not have just one system, but two or possibly more. So it seems to me that within the morality system, we ought to do what morality prescribes.
Yeah.
But when we also include the heart or like love system,
Something else.
that, yeah, but it's I don't know. I think it's like less straightforward to infer what we should do.
Yeah.
So, for example, suppose you harm me, so now it is appropriate for me to have hard feelings.
Yeah.
But you didn't wrong me, so it is not appropriate for me to blame you.
Yeah.
So I cannot. I mean, I don't have a strong reason to revise our relationship.
Yeah.
As maybe Scandal would want because
Yeah.
you didn't blame me.
Yeah.
But I don't want to see you anymore because you harmed me.
Yeah.
So what should I do in this case?
So let me see if I've got this right. So one question is reasons of the heart versus obligations.
Yeah.
They can conflict easily, right? So, I have a heartfelt relationship to you, but you stole something and you need to be held accountable for that. Maybe I'm obligated to do something in that process, but I also have this heartfelt connection to you. Which reasons are the strongest reasons? Is that the kind of question you're asking?
Yeah, especially since within the morality systems we have requiring reasons, like
Yeah.
The antic reasons.
Good.
So in the heart system,
Yeah.
it feels like they are not requiring reasons.
They're not
but
requiring
they're
reasons.
intuitions.
Yeah.
So it feels like,
Yeah.
how can I, avoid it?
Yeah. So I've got an answer to this question actually, in the second person standpoint. And the idea is, so the general question is, why should we do what we're obligated to do? What we're all things considered obligated to do? Because maybe that will conflict with we have other really strong reasons to do, and they could be reasons of any kind you like. And the argument comes from Bernard Williams, actually. He has this paper called Internal Reasons and the Obscurity of Blame. And the idea is that it's a presupposition of blame, that someone can't be to blame, fittingly blame, they can't be blameworthy, if they had sufficient reason for doing what you're blaming them for doing. So if they did have sufficient reason, they'd have a justification. But that's inconsistent with being blameworthy. So then it just follows that if what they're doing is blameworthy, lacking some excuse, that is to say morally wrong, a violation of their all things considered moral duty, then they can't, on pain of contradiction, have sufficient reason to do, to do what you were fittingly blaming them for doing. So moral obligations, I think, always trump. Now, of course, whether something is morally obligatory or not is not a simple question. And it may be that something's not really morally obligatory since we can't really expect people to do it because of all these other pressures. So that all comes into the calculation of whether or not they're really morally obligated. But if they really are morally obligated, and it would be blameworthy for them not to do it without excuse, then it just follows that they always have conclusive reason to do we always have conclusive reason to do what we're morally obligated to do. It's a big claim, but I think it's right. Yeah.
Thank you. I've got Max and then Robin. Yeah, you mentioned that only second-person competent beings are capable of moral obligation.
Yeah.
But if this ties that morality inherently to those interpersonal relationships, then what is it that remains to separate those things of morality versus stuff that's born purely out of those interpersonal relationships, like social constructs? What remains to ground that morality?
Let's see if I've got this. So I'm saying that moral obligations is ultimately grounded in second personal relations. And the claim, and this is an argument I make in the second person standpoint, is that whenever we make a putatively legitimate claim or demand on someone, we're presupposing two things. we're presupposing first that they're capable of doing what we're demanding they do, and not just that they can perform the act, but that they can perform it for the very reason that they're obligated to do it. Okay, so that, or if you like, that they have a conscience. So only beings that have conscience can be obligated, and they can do what they're obligated to do just by acting from their conscience, which they can do. They're just doing their job. Okay? So do your job. Okay. Now, then there's this problem about, well, what if they have good reasons to do something else? And I just gave them the argument for why no reason could be good enough to trump a moral obligation. Somehow I think, though, I haven't really quite gotten to your question.
I was more so thinking that if something is born purely as a result of these, collection of consciences, pronunciation, but if something is born purely out of that, then does that inherently make it moral?
Well, paradoxically, yes. Because what is it to have a conscience is to be able to first find out stuff about the world and to take yourself to be obligated to find out stuff about the world so that you can do what you can be held justifiably accountable for doing, including finding stuff about the world that's relevant to what you should do. So we're presuming that what it takes to be obligated doesn't require any special knowledge. There's, every being who we can hold accountable has what it takes to hold themselves accountable. And if there's special knowledge, well, either they can't be really obligated to have that special knowledge, in which case they're not really obligated to act, or they are obligated to find it out and they just haven't found it out, so they've been negligent. So yeah, I think it just is true that we put it very simply, we all have the ability to do our job, and that's all we have to do. Yeah. Where our job just is to hold ourselves accountable as equal moral agents and respect each other. Yeah.
Robin, and then I got Matt.
Yeah.
So apologies for having missed the talk, but I have read both books, which is
Apologies for what?
for having missed the talk I was teaching.
Oh. I see. Yeah. So I didn't. Oh, you came in late. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
yeah.
Apology accepted.
I'm pretty sure that this hasn't been pressed because different people were pressing about the relationship between love and respect.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm trying to get at. So, on your view, human beings have two different, fundamentally different types.
Well, I'm now convinced three.
What?
I'm now convinced three.
Okay. Okay.
There's Kwong value. There's two Darwall values. Right?
Okay. And throughout the literature, the love literature, there is a very interesting attempt to square love with morality.
Yeah.
So the partiality of love has been seen by many people as in conflict
Yeah.
with morality.
Yeah.
So we see David Bellman, for instance, subsuming love to a moral emotion,
Right.
where it is like this being in touch in a very special way,
Right.
an emotional way,
An arrested
another
appreciation
person,
of the others.
arrested, right?
Yeah.
And vulnerable in the face of another person's rational being.
Yeah.
So one of the features of Velleman's view and Setye's view, both of them, is that there's a very close relationship between attitudes of love and attitudes of respect.
Yeah.
For both of them, attitudes of respect are minimal
Yeah.
ways of attending to another, and
Yeah.
attitudes of love are these maximal ways.
Yeah.
But we just can't love everybody, so we keep
Yeah.
it minimal.
Yeah.
And in the lucky cases,
Yeah.
we end up loving them. I'm not a proponent of either view.
Yeah.
I think both of them fail to capture the nature of love
Yeah.
itself and the differences between the two of them.
Yeah.
But there is this new, I think, really promising new view on the scene by Quid White. And what
Love
has
first.
something to do view is to reverse exactly. So on his love first view, he's attempting to say, well, love is the more primitive notion, and respect is this, we can't like love everybody, even though in principle we can love everyone because we can open our hearts to everybody. And in that way, his view of love is very much in sync with your view of what loving is like, and kind of the phenomenological and moral aspects of it, and its distinctive qualities. So I guess what I'm wondering is why, how your view is related to that view, and why, like, would you be resistant to seeing respect, which doesn't really seem to have that much of a phenomenological feel, as being, what we can do when we can't kind of practically love everybody, but in principle we can.
Well, Quinn White was a student of mine. He was in directed studies in his first year, and he took 3 other courses with me, and I have ultimate respect and indeed love for Quinn White. But he's just wrong. Right, so here's where I think he's wrong. I just think that, so first on Velleman and Sethi, I would know more about the Velleman view. I think that's missing the heartfelt part of it. Yeah, okay, good. So Quinn's got the heartfelt part of it, but I don't think he has real respect. So how do you get rights out of love of any form? I just don't see it. What is a right? A right is a standing to demand something. If you have the right that I not step on your foot, then I'm obligated to you not to step on your foot, and I'll owe you compensation if I do, and I'm personally accountable to you for that. So there are all these sort of accountability relations that come into that are part of the right in its nature. And the right just has a fundamentally different conceptual structure, I think, than any form of the good, including the form of intrinsic good or value that comes in and being, lovable, being not that at all, being worthy of love. So you've got Velleman arguing that respect is just a weaker form of love, and I guess Quinn's agreeing with that. Is that right?
So he hasn't, so far as I can see, he hasn't fully developed the relationship entirely between the two of them. But what I see him doing is he's putting the fact that, so again, a point that you agree with in is that we are all beings that are I don't know, it's possible to love each one of us, where each one of us is worthy of love. That's something that he agrees with. And I think that what he's attempting to do is to say that's the foundation, not the foundation is not. We are all rational beings, and it's because, or in virtue of our being rational beings, that we're entitled to respect. So the thing that I think that I'm very attracted to his view is because I understand what it is to feel like I'm worthy of love and to love others. That's very intuitive to me, and I think it's intuitive to lots of people. And
me too.
That seems like an excellent way to kind of ground the idea that we should be acting toward others and maybe setting up a system of rights toward others based upon that notion, as opposed to seeing respect, rationality itself as the locus of rights.
So I think where I get off the bus, as they say, is seeing you as worthy of love and loving you, having my heart open to you, is not yet in the neighborhood of seeing you as entitled to demand anything of me. Okay. Now, you might think, okay, I get that, but that's just legal stuff, right? And, the lawyers come in when love fails, right? Right? So it's love that really matters. That's what we really want anyway. And we only go to the lawyers when it's not happening, okay? So then you could think of the fundamental value being this, love first is the fundamental attitude, and then you could think that we need something artificial that we can construct, an idea of law, an idea of rights. And its justification is not that we're entitled to it just as second personally deontically capable beings, or that we're accountable to one another. It's that, no, it'll be better for all of us if we have this structure. So you get a kind of indirect justification for rights and duties and so on. But it's a fallback position. It's something that we really wish we didn't have to have. And I don't like that. I think we need both of them. And I think that, and the other problem is I just don't see how you can get out of a love first account the conceptual guarantee that we always have sufficient reason to do what we're morally obligated to do. Because all you're going to get from the moral obligation side is it's an artificial virtue, let's say, a set of rules, artifices, and practices that we institute because it's good for all of us. And that's what really is, what's moving us to that is love first. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
So actually, Quinn's going to be here in 20 days workshopping with us.
Yeah.
We've got Matt, and there's 5 more people in the queue that we're not going to get to. I apologize, but Matt's going to close it up for us with the final question.
All right, thank you very much, Professor. So I'm interested in your thoughts about the phenomenon of loving the dead, in particular, loving people who were formerly loved ones. So there's a quite natural sense in which it makes sense to speak of loving the dead, to speak of them as being worthy of love, of it being fitting to love the dead, and having reasons to, and maybe even it being the case that we ought to continue loving those, particularly if we have a close personal relationship. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem like we can rationally hope or aim at any kind of reciprocal heartfelt connection with those who have died. So how do we square those two?
Yeah. Well, my sister died this summer. I loved my sister. Do I still love my sister? I don't know. I mean, I still have, I'll tear up. I have all the same feelings. There are things I can do for her to make sure that, her son is okay. But there's no reciprocation there. I think we just have to be clear what we're talking about. So the love of the second personal kind no longer is an option, sadly. I imagine conversations, I have sweet memories, but I can't actively relate to her and hope that she relates back to me. So I think, but, so the things we can do, things we can't do. And if we're just clear about what they are, it doesn't really much matter what we call them. Yeah.
Please join me in thanking Professor Darwall.
Thank you.